years ago, I decided to become a Christian, and I didn't tell anyone about it. In fact, I didn't tell anybody about it for about 10 years. And this is kind of odd, because I actually love telling good stories. And as some of you have heard parts of the story of how I became a Christian, and it is a great story. It involves a Tanzanian neighbor who carried a bookshelf to my house on the back of his bicycle. It involves a used car in Mississippi that refused to play any radio station except the Christian music station. And I am not making that one up. It's also odd because I was taping Bible verses on my bedroom walls. So my house was not exactly whispering about my new faith. It was kind of shouting it to anyone who walked in. I even taped a verse from the book of Hebrews over my desk. It said, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." I didn't tell anybody about that. Because for some reason, I actually find it really hard to talk about faith, even though it matters a lot to me. I think because it matters a lot to me. If someone asks me why I believe in God, which is not exactly a popular belief in Cambridge, but if someone asks me why, I get tongue-tied. I mumble some indecipherable syllables, something about love and hope and light in the darkness. Then I change the subject as fast as I can. This has become a problem lately because I'm about to apply to divinity school. And it is really, really hard of explaining why you're applying to divinity school to become a pastor and not mentioning faith at all. And I could be wrong about this, but I do hear that pastors are supposed to be able to talk about faith without changing the subject. So I'm going to try this morning. I want to give you some pictures of faith as I've lived it and experienced it. Pictures of what it feels like to orient your life, not by a carefully bulleted 5-year plan, but by the substance of things hoped for, by the evidence of things not seen. Pictures of what it feels like to direct your feet, not by a map that tells you exactly which way to turn in 5.26 miles, but by the call of a God who usually asks us to step straight off the map into the unknown. First, faith does not mean doing nothing. Doesn't mean we sit down and relax and wait for God to act. It doesn't mean sitting by an unplanted garden saying, "God will provide," and not bothering to put a single seed in the soil. Faith means doing everything we can, even when we're sure it's not enough, especially when we're sure it's not enough. Faith means planting every seed we have, even when all we have is a wrinkled seed packet that we dug out of the pocket of some pants from the basement. It means watering those seeds day after day after day, even when we don't see a single sprout, even when we're sure the birds have already gobbled them all. Faith means giving our money and time to efforts that feed the hungry, that heal the sick, that welcome the stranger, even when we know our efforts are barely a speck in an ocean of need. Faith means shouting for justice, even when we're sure the winds of greed and hatred will swallow our voices, even when our throats ache, even when those winds seem to be rising into a hurricane around us. Faith means following the words of St. Ignatius. He said, "Act as if everything depended on you. Trust as if everything depended on God." Faith means believing in a God strong enough to part a sea too wide for us to swim across, to multiply a few bread and fish into a meal that can feed a crowd. But faith also means knowing we can't just sit waiting on the shore of the sea. We have to step into the water. We have to take out those few bread and fish we have and put them on a plate. Second, faith means taking the first step, even when we can't see the next one. It means following God's call into the unknown and stepping out, like Abraham and Sarah, not knowing where we're going. Faith means taking the first step when we not only can't see the end of the path, we can't even see the next turn. Even when we're sure there's a wall right ahead of us, blocking the path that God has been calling us to. Because if we don't take that first step, we won't see that there's a door right in the middle of that wall. And the door is locked, but the key is right on the ground in front of us. So some of you know that one of my Christian heroes is a man named Clarence Jordan. Clarence was a Baptist pastor and a New Testament scholar. And in the 1940s, in Georgia, United States, Georgia, he decided to found an interracial Christian community. So let me put those words together again. 1950s Georgia with an interracial community. Clarence got death threats from the Ku Klux Klan. He heard bullets rip through the walls of the farm buildings at night. And he never changed his plan, and he never stopped being committed to an interracial community, and he lived by faith every single day. Clarence has one of the best metaphors of faith that I have ever heard. He said, faith is like an automatic door. And if you stand 30 feet back and look at an automatic door, it doesn't open. And if you walk a little closer, you're 10 feet away, but safely away from that door, it still doesn't open. So you walk a little closer, and then you put your foot almost against the door, and that's when it opens. Faith isn't about knowing every step of the road. It's about stepping onto it anyway. Knowing that the door will open when the time is right. Knowing that when we follow God's call, we don't walk alone. Because the God who walked with Abraham and who walked with Sarah walks with us into the unknown too. Third, faith doesn't mean staring up at heaven. It doesn't mean you're bending your neck so far toward the sky that you don't see that person in front of you who's hungry and asking for food. Faith means looking at the world. It means staring the world straight in the eyes. It means seeing the dark places and seeing the broken places, but still waking up each morning with hope in your heart. It means stepping out into that broken world and planting the mustard seed of the kingdom of God, even if there's a tariff on mustard seeds. Even if all the funds from the government for mustard seeds have been cut because they are clearly a waste of taxpayer dollars. Wendell Berry wrote that we should be joyful, even if we have considered all the facts. Faith lets us look straight at the facts of the world and still act with hope and still act with joy. And that brings me back to a small part of the story of how I ended up standing here preaching in a church. Some of you know that I'm writing a novel. And as a novelist, if I were writing about myself in my early 20s, I would not have placed me preaching in a church today. There were too many plot twists and turns, and they were not leading in this direction at all. But if you read my newsletter this week, you know I spent my early 20s trying to save the world. Not by doing anything grand. I was certainly not in any headlines. I was a science teacher. But I was teaching in places where life was difficult. I was teaching in places where poverty was a fact of life, and where the problems from my students' home constantly spilled into the classroom. And I could teach well, but I could not solve the problems that my students brought to school with them. So I threw my heart and my soul into teaching, and I exhausted myself. And it wasn't working, so I worked harder, and I exhausted myself more, and it still wasn't working. And everything I tried felt like a drop of mist above an ocean of need. In the middle of all this, I got invited to a Bible study group. And I read the Bible for the first time. And I have to admit, a lot of lines were completely baffling and very strange. And then there were the lines that I read again and again. And I taped them to my bedroom wall, even though I didn't tell anybody about that at the time. One of those lines was, "And now abide these three, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love." Paul tells us that the greatest is love. But he lists faith first. And I think there's a reason that he does that. It's the reason I'm standing in front of you here today. Because when the world grows dark, faith is what sustains our hope. When the world breaks our heart, it's faith that gives us the strength and the courage to keep loving. Faith tells us our actions don't have to be enough. We don't have to carry the burden of repairing the whole world alone. We can only do a little. We all know we can only do a little. But God can act through us. God can take what we do and multiply it. God can multiply it like those few breads and fishes that fed a crowd, like a tiny bit of yeast that can leaven an entire loaf of bread. Faith tells us we can only plant tiny seeds. It also tells us that seeds grow. Faith tells us we may only be able to light one candle. It also tells us that one candle can light a whole line of candles. One candle can light a whole fire. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Clarence Jordan, who founded that interracial community in Georgia, had his own translation of the Bible into the Southern vernacular. It's called the Cotton Patch Gospel. And in the Cotton Patch Gospel, he translates that line from Hebrews like this: faith is the turning of dreams into deeds. It is betting your life on the unseen realities. Faith means betting our life on a God who called Abraham onto an unknown path, but into a land of promise. It means betting our lives on a God who doesn't watch us from a distance, but who came down to the world to heal all of creation. Faith means looking straight at a world that can break our hearts and hearing the voices of cynicism and despair all around us. And it means choosing anyway to bet our life on a God of hope and of love, and standing and putting on our dust-covered shoes and walking straight into that broken world, knowing fully that we can't do enough, and knowing what we do matters, and it matters deeply.